You're watching Morning at NTV.
With us, it's just about 4 minutes after the hour of 8. You are watching Morning at NTV. For those that are just joining us, we are at the Kickstarter segment and we are looking at Uganda's tax system. 2024, what were the tax trends and what changes are being rolled out by government? That is, of course, under the Uganda Revenue Authority. But we also want to understand what are the complexities when it comes to revenue collection. Consistently, there have been concerns about Uganda Revenue Authority falling short of targets that were set in terms of tax revenue, and many officials have attributed to so many factors, including the fact that the base for taxation is so narrow to be able to register anything significant. I'll be introducing my guests very shortly, but let me just take you through most studies on tax research that have focused on developing countries, and those concentrate on subjects of general application. As a result, discussions and research on many aspects of tax applicable to low-income countries has been neglected. By presenting an in-depth analysis of Uganda's tax system, some discussions have sought to address this gap, and we do want to understand that too. Uganda is currently a low-income country faced with the familiar dilemma of needing to raise the level of tax as a share of gross domestic product significantly in order to fund government projects and programs, while simultaneously wanting to provide economic environment that encourages both domestic and inward investment. This is a whole lot of stuff to internalize, and in the studio this morning I have with me Dennis Kakembo, a tax lawyer, and Mark Ruhindi, a tax lawyer too, to help us get around this maze. You're both welcome to the program, gentlemen.
Thank you, Chris.
Let me first begin with a very basic question, one that every layman like me would ask out there. If I were to seek to understand the tax system that is rolled out by governments across the globe, you would want to know what exactly does Uganda have in terms of its tax structure. And if you don't mind, Mark, let me begin with you.
Good morning, viewers. Uganda's tax system is a self-assessment system, and so the taxpayer is allowed to declare the income as they think is correctly assessed. And then if there is a contestation on the declaration, the deductions that you've sought to claim on your gross income, if there is a contestation by URA, then that becomes a dispute. But the starting point is that the taxpayer is permitted to declare as per the tax code what they think is due from them to the government. Okay. So that is under the Income Tax Act. At least that's the kind of system that we operate under income tax.
Okay. So what is the? Would I be correct to say what is the lineup of the taxes that the average Ugandan has to deal with, whether you're an industrialist, whether you're a worker, an employee, or even just the guy who is going about life?
So a line, there are quite many, really.
Yeah, let's understand.
But under the Income Tax Act, we have income tax is taxed under the heads of business income, employment income, property income, and then there is rental tax. So the business income is you have to run a business.
That's right.
You have a business, and the business in tax law, it's a technical word. It has to, there is a threshold. There are certain elements that the operation must meet for it to be deemed as to be deemed to fit in that definition. And then one of the examples is if you run the business under an LLC, a business vehicle, a formal business vehicle. Yeah. There is a repetition of activities. There is, say, you have a formal locus in core, a formal office like this building. Employment income, everyone is aware of the pay as you earn. You pay as you earn on a salary.
That one that presses us to the wall.
Yes, property income. That involves, it's quite broad. You're talking about loyalties, you're talking about dividends on shares. So property income is not per se building, rental, tax or capital gains. It's quite broad. Okay. And then, obviously, I've talked about rental income. Tax. If your viewers are aware of the current URS stand on pressing hard on taxpayers to declare rental income as opposed to before. Okay. Then we have to go to outside the VAT, outside the income tax statute. Of course, you have the different taxes levied under the different statutes. You have VAT. VAT is not per se tax on the business; it's commercial neutral. So what you put in, it's not the business that pays the tax, but the ultimate consumer of the goods or service. So what you put in, you're allowed to deduct it off what goes out. Okay. Then you have stamp duty, you have excise duty.
All right, that is well, I could say a lot of things that we shall be able to break down as we continue this conversation. But allow me bring in Dennis Kakembo. When you look at the availability of all these taxes available to Uganda Revenue Authority and specifically government, so to speak, to be able to get whatever revenue it can get out of the people, do you see it as workable, or are there aspects that need to be improved within the existing framework so that revenues can be realized?
I think for us to be able to answer the question whether Uganda's tax regime is working, the different taxes that Mark has mentioned, we need first and foremost to interrogate what government's aspiration is in terms of tax revenue collections. For the longest time, the government has wanted to collect a tax in terms of tax collection, a ratio of tax to GDP of about 18%. Okay. For the longest time, that has been the aspiration of government. But for the longest time, I think over the last 15 years, Uganda Revenue Authority has not been able to exceed 13% tax collections as a ratio of the GDP.
It has set 18%?
Yes.
It hasn't been able to go beyond 13%?
Yes, over 13%. So all the tax measures we've seen happen through the years, increasing taxes, introducing online filing, they've all been geared at improving tax collections, which has not worked. And for that reason, some of us are starting to tell government that perhaps you need to rethink the direction of tax changes. Because if you do the same thing over and over again and results remain the same, it actually means there's something fundamentally wrong. So it's not about the taxes. The taxes Mark has mentioned, Uganda has them, Tanzania has them, Kenya has them, Rwanda has them. But when you compare our tax performance in terms of how much we collect as a percent of GDP, we lag behind our regional peers. And why are we lagging behind our regional peers? First and foremost, I, for one, I take the view that because URA is assessed quantitatively, how much have you collected this year? There's a tendency of short-termism. So what the Commissioner General or what the people at the Tax Policy Division of the Ministry of Finance are focusing at achieving is a noticeable improvement in quantitative collections the following year, regardless of whether this can affect the long-term performance of the economy. Because the tax system does not operate in a vacuum. It operates within the general economy. If the economy is not doing well, certainly you as the Uganda Revenue Authority are not going to collect taxes. If you as Uganda Revenue Authority or as government you introduce taxes and the URA overly aggressively enforces them, some businesses close. We've seen some businesses actually leave this country because of a very aggressive tax regime. And if a business leaves this country, then how are you going to be able to collect the taxes? And in terms of short-termism, we can also relate it to how some companies are run. In the subject of performance management, I as a managing director, if you're assessing me exclusively on the basis of the bottom line, chances are that I'm going to come to a company and then cut training costs, which deliver much longer term value, but in the short term, because I'm able to save that cost, you'll actually see that I've performed well. So some elements of our tax system are too much short term. And that is the trend we've seen for the last 5 years. So many of the tax changes which have come through in the last 5 years have tended to be strange and not easily understandable. For instance, if you recall about 5 years ago, the president rightly had a concern that probably Uganda Revenue Authority was not aggressively pushing. And I remember he wrote a letter bashing URA that you're denying me 200 shillings that I can collect on social media. And he did his tabulation, and it seemed to suggest that actually a lot of taxes would be collected. But when we got into the implementation, things did not work out that way. Then also, I remember there's what we call withholding VAT. What happens when I, as a lawyer, I issue an invoice to my client, the VAT that I've levied there is supposed to be paid by the client, and then when it's paid, that's when I remit to URA. But now URA introduced something called withholding VAT. So essentially, the other party pays you less the VAT you've billed, and then you as a business, you're supposed to incur that, probably borrow or even it into your cash flows. Now, those are very short-term measures that actually affect the performance of the economy. And then also, lastly, what I can also hinge on is that we do not have a comprehensive tax policy that informs how government goes about determining tax changes. In as much as we have the NDP, the National Development Plan, that lays out a broad aspiration of increasing tax performance to 18%, in as much as we have the domestic revenue mobilization strategy, we do not have a comprehensive document. And for that reason, we lack guidance. And that is why, quite often, in fact, many times, I have seen the chief amendment officer of the tax laws lately is the president. The president feels let down by his officials. So every day when tax is about to be levied, you see him writing a letter telling URA, what's happening? You're sleeping on the job, rental tax, you're not collecting, this and that. Now that points to the fact that we lack a proper policy guideline, because tax is highly technical. I would not expect a head of state to be overly involved if his officials are actually doing their job. And and also what happens in practice as a result of that, because of laws keep changing, you don't know what informs policy, it encourages lobbying. So the big organizations will go to parliament, and lobbying many times is opportunistic. And those who are likely to succeed in lobbying are the powerful. The powerful, the ones who are able to grease arms. Yes. So it's a big challenge, and that is why we need to rethink the entire strategy. Otherwise, what URA tells us, or what the government says, we need to collect this, we need to hit 18%, it's going to remain a pipe dream.
Allow me pick Mark Ruhindi's mind on the tax policy dilemma, the fact that we don't have one. First of all, it's a new revelation. Ideally,
we do have a tax policy.
We do have a tax policy?
He said it's short-term. It lacks a long-term element.
In other words, it's not comprehensive enough.
Well, you might say that. There is an amendment that was made that came through last year, and I wrote about it. The Parliament took away 20% the initial allowance on industrial buildings and plant and machinery. We had we had an investment incentive to investors investing outside Kampala, 50 kilometers radius outside Kampala. So the business will be allowed to deduct a one-off 20% industrial allowance under capital deductions prior to the depreciation that is allowed. Under capital deductions, an investor will be allowed to deduct that one-off in the first year of putting down the capital outlay on plant and machinery or in an industrial building. That's a hotel, a factory plant, machinery in a factory. So Parliament took away this investment incentive, and that speaks to what he has just said in regards to that short-termism. I speculated that probably this policy it took into account the police and Hoima oil investments, but now that the policy now took out every businessman's incentive to invest outside Kampala. If you're to take a plant to Mbarara, you lost that. If you had planned to take a plant to Mbarara, you lost that allowance. If you plan to take a plant to Mbale, you lost that allowance. So the rest of the market was collateral damage. I just speculated. I'm not saying that that's what the policy was intended for, but if that's what it was intended for, then the rest of the market now was collateral damage, which is not good, because if
that speaks to perhaps losses that many of us may not even be aware of that the government is incurring. But again, it flies in the face of the notions that are usually peddled by the president himself, including tax incentives to huge industrialists, especially those that are referred to as, well, we have two investors in Uganda. We have the investors and then we have the investors. But when tax incentives are rolled out to huge industrialists who are actually capable of increasing or significantly changing the revenue collection statistics for the good, then that is more like an economic own goal on our part as a country.
It's not an own goal. The fact that this business is allowed to put down a lot of money, because this money is mobilized. They are taking capital from other businesses through transfer, through multinational enterprises are taking money through transfer pricing transactions from other businesses to come and invest in Uganda. They're taking on liabilities. So these incentives take into account that capital mobilization to allow these businesses to mobilize that capital and bring it here. And so if they are not allowed to, if they are not given those incentives, then it hits us, because other countries are giving the incentives. From a FDI angle, it hits us because we are not competitive enough. And then you have to take into account that the more investment is done, the more investment is allowed into the country, the more employment is being created. You're paying pay as you earn on your salary. So it's obvious that the short-termism he has mentioned can be looked at, can be pointed out through these kinds of policies that we're talking about. Okay, so there we have we basically have a solution. We should move away from short-termism and begin to plan a little bit better for sustainable taxation. All right, just allow me move to the aspects regarding minimizing underreporting and miscalculation by firms in terms of excisable goods. The government introduced the digital tax stamps on some goods that attract excise tax. That was more than 2 years ago.
that is 2019-2020 financial year. How have these digital stamps enabled government to strengthen tax administration and perhaps boost revenue? If you don't mind, Dennis?
Okay. Just before I answer that, I wanted to supplement a little, to just digress a little bit, for a minute. In terms of tax incentives, it's one area that is not well understood. Some people look at tax incentives as necessarily something that is actually taking away from government, which may not be the case. Because look at it this way. If I am coming to invest into Uganda, I am going to bring in capital items which are not manufactured locally. So if I have to bring in machinery that is costing $2 million, you may find that under your tax regime, I may have to pay import duty of 25%. I also have to pay VAT of 18%. So if you do not restrict me to pay those taxes, it would actually mean that rather than me spend an extra $1 million in building a factory premise, I spend that on paying taxes, which is actually akin to government taxing investment as opposed to taxing profits. So the discussion on incentives needs to be approached carefully, and any incentive that taxes profits is okay, but an incentive that enables taxpayers not to incur money, not to leak money that is earmarked for investment should be sustained. Now, coming to the issue of digital stamp is one of the measures that government has embarked on to minimize tax leakage. One of the other measures that government has come up with is what they call IFRS invoices. Now, for IFRS invoices, it's a timely tool, real time. Whenever you issue an invoice, government is able to see the revenues you're getting or you're earning, and I think the digital stamp also works a bit like that. Previously, what used to happen, government was concerned that it was failing to determine the production by the beverage companies, by the cement companies, that there was a lot of maybe underreporting which was happening in between production and what is actually reported. But with the digital stamp, it actually helps manage that, because it's real-time way of tracking what's happening in terms of production. And of course, I remember when URA was enforcing this measure, there was a bit of opposition from the manufacturers, but it's been vindicated. Ever since the digital stamp was actually introduced or rolled out, we've seen an increment in revenue performance, which is okay, because I mean that is an aspect of tax administration. There are areas where if URA strengthened its tax administration, you can actually find yourself as a country collecting a little bit more revenues, and then also leveraging on IT technology. URA is doing that fairly well. Sometimes third-party information, if you leverage on the data that is collected here, there, URA can easily discern that this person has actually earned income here and has not paid taxes. So those are some of the measures that Uganda Revenue Authority should continue to enforce and improve. The only challenge some of us have is that government usually goes for the soft targets. Like, there was an amendment last year which was passed restricting tax losses. So to put it in perspective, if the owner of NTV comes and invests $10 million in terms of capital assets, there's what we call a deduction that you earn. And that deduction, while you might be making revenues, because you're still recovering your capital costs, you're not technically profitable for you to pay taxes. So URA took away, sorry, not URA, but the law took away the ability to continuously recover your costs, so that you only start paying taxes when you're strictly technical. And one of the reasons which was fronted by government was that some taxpayers are abusing that. Now, if a few taxpayers are abusing Uganda's tax regime, should it mean that the laws we come up with should punish everyone, or URA should enhance its ability to administer so that it goes after those people, because it has a right to go and audit? So now the digital stamp it's one of the good measures that can demonstrate how tax authorities can harness their administrative abilities to improve tax collections without necessarily hurting everyone, coming up with blanket laws that affect everyone. Yes.
All right, Mark, how possible is it to achieve that? That is a tax administration regime that does not. You spoke about the fact that it's not. It doesn't. The ones that are responsible for the shortfalls are not actually cited.
So he alluded to now having the entire market become collateral damage to a few non-compliant
How can
players.
we achieve a scenario where those that ought to act up or rather get in line are actually the ones that URA goes for?
It is enforcement. It's a question of enforcement. You see, the law applies to everyone equally.
That's right.
So if the law says you must issue an invoice through a freeze, then let everyone issue let every taxable person, VAT taxable person, issue an invoice through a freeze. And URA is doing that quite well. This system was introduced, I think, was it 2020? And for the last so many years, it was fought, and then a few players embraced it. Those that have not embraced it have come to understand that this is actually a good measure for purposes of the compliance, even on the income tax side. And so what URA has to do is ensure that especially these kinds of measures that seek to enforce the law as it applies to everyone are enforced across the board. And I think the part of tax education has been discharged. URA has discharged that duty quite well. So it's
I would ask what might appear to be a naive question, but one that the average guy out there might want to ask. A selective application of the law on the part of URA, it's an allegation from my journalistic point of view, the inability to go for those that are supposed to do the basic aspect of a payment of that particular tax. Does URA understand, and I'm sure you've interacted broadly or many times with some of the officials, do they understand those capacity challenges, and do they have a blueprint, or it's the usual increase our budget allocation?
What do you mean the capacity challenges?
Capacity to be able to enforce.
URA has been allocated resources to enforce a freeze. And I think I also I made.
So we can rightly blame URA.
See, URA has the capacity.
Yeah.
If you fall under a VAT threshold, URA has the capacity to come to your business, retrospectively register the business and raise tax. Okay. So this building, Serena Hotel, it has been the subject of such tax, and I think that tax was upheld by an appellate court. So URA has the capacity to enforce the law as it is and as it applies to everyone. So the selective application of the law, perhaps they have the blame, because they have the ammunition to enforce the law against everyone as it applies. Not just go after the few compliant players and then
all right, we hope the president can come up with what Dennis said he usually affords us when he does some of those addresses. Now, if you don't mind, on the 15th of June, that is last year, Uganda Revenue Authority issued a public notice serving as a reminder to the public to pay stamp duty on all agreements, and what's described here as memorandum of agreement executed or received in Uganda in relation to the purchase and transfer of property. In their notice, it stated, and I quote, "Any person who purchases or transfers property should present the agreement or memorandum of agreement together with the transfer and consent forms to URA for stamp duty assessment, payment, barcoding, and generation of a stamp certificate. Whereas URA notice specifically addressed the transfer, it is important to note the scope of the provision in this law extends beyond just the transfer of property. That's very confusing. Help us around this particular issue of this memorandum of agreement.
Now, that relates to stamp duty. And stamp duty is a tax that is payable on technically what you call a chargeable instrument. And in layman's instrument, what is in layman's language, what is an instrument? It's that document that probably creates or confers a right. So it would mean that if you go and buy land and you execute an agreement, that is a chargeable instrument on which you're expected to have it registered as a document and then pay stamp duty at the specified rate. Then if any kind of agreement that we enter into, maybe sale of car or even an agreement to do something, all that would fall within the category of a chargeable instrument to which you must pay stamp duty. So URA issued that communication just to remind taxpayers of the obligation they have to go for. Of course, the challenge that you're having, or the challenge that URA is having, is that it's strictly the nature of our economy. You have the formal and the informal sector of the economy.
The informal sector is really huge.
Yes, and people do not have known addresses. They do not play within the formal economy. So tracing them sometimes becomes a challenge, or it also becomes extremely costly. You're using so much money to chase so little money.
That is right.
And I think that is why URA goes after the bigger taxpayers, because they are the easier people to go after. And I wouldn't blame URA. It's not the mandate of URA to restructure the economy. That is the mandate of government. And that is why some of us feel that if for the last 15 years you've struggled to increase tax collections, why have you struggled? It's because of the structure of the economy. Now, if you had started 15 years ago, deliberate and intentional efforts around moving, shifting the nature of the economy, bringing people more onto the tax register. You may actually register people onto the tax register, encourage them to pay tax, rather file tax returns, not necessarily for them to pay taxes, but you're encouraging them to come on board, so that you let them grow. And that
be formal. There's
so that
a lot of growth that comes from being formal.
From being formal. But we do not see those kind of things. And in fact, a joke amongst us taxpayers is normally said that the moment, even if you're a very small tax business, the moment you formalize, you go get a tin, and you're under the rod of URA, they are going to quickly come for you. So which would mean that for us to be able to achieve all those things, I think we need to rethink the tax threshold. Honestly, if someone has a turnover of 500 million, given the inflation and the state of the economy, probably those people may not have to pay taxes. But the fact that they are not paying taxes, you may not exempt them from preparing financial statements. You may not exempt them from preparing returns, because by so doing, they are growing, they are becoming formal, they are keeping documentation, which is key for us shifting the structure of the economy. So government needs to think. They need to think critically, come up with bold measures. This business of going for NTV, let's go for UBL, let's go for MTN, Celtel, is not going to help them achieve the target of 38 trillion next year, or overall the 18% ratio to tax collection, because the tax base, if you do not include fully the informal sector, will continue to lag behind and remain narrow.
Okay, your view on that, Mark, and perhaps something on the amendments that were registered in 2023. Do they point to the fact that perhaps the government is trying to minimize the movement, uncoordinated movement of troops with regard to taxation? Do the amendments help?
In regards to the stamp duty amendment?
And these other aspects that are basically seeing us fail to meet many of the targets in far as revenue collection is concerned?
Well, the stamp duty, meanwhile the stamp duty, those are those guidelines that were issued. That tax has been in place for, I think, since 2016, since the 2014, since the Stamp Duty Act was promulgated. So it's merely a question of enforcement. The tax has been in place. It's not. It was not an amendment that brought that introduced a new tax a new tax head. The tax has always been in place. So the requirement that when you're transacting, say when you're trying to transfer property when a vendor is trying to transfer property to a purchaser, that you both have to have a tin, that you both have to have a tin. That is merely to enable URA properly ascertain the cost base, the initial cost of the property at the time it was sold, so that when it's subsequently resold, then there is a way to compute capital gains tax. Capital gains tax has always been in place under the Income Tax Act. So these measures are intended to allow URA to easily track and compute capital gains tax on those transactions, because the moment you transact and there is a hit on your tin, then there is it allows URA a trail through which to now, when there's a subsequent sale, a resale of the property, or if you're doing real estate as a business, there's a way to ascertain that you're doing business or this was a one-off transaction, so that it's easy to either tax you as a businessman or as or not tax you, because if you're not doing business, then you can't be taxed.
Okay, gentlemen, we are nearing the conversation end, and I would like to now delve into what could be general economic trends that, of course, do shape the taxation policies and regimes across the region. Kenya, we are seeing the introduction of a range of taxes as the government there tries to deal with the debt crisis. All African countries, most in fact, are indebted and are grappling to ensure that the servicing does continue without much default. But of course there is a lot of discomfort when taxes are introduced within the settings, and in Kenya we've seen President William Ruto particularly find himself in a spot of bother. Going into the budget, of course the budget framework paper is already out, and media, we shall be expecting that iconic speech. What are your projections? What do you see as aspects that government will have to quickly work on in order to ensure that this does not become a broken record, year in, year out, the same story about we are lacking this, and then we go into supplementary budgets?
I think what I can say, you cannot, of course, I know tax is a compulsory levy. It's not a quid pro quo. You can't say, you as a taxpayer, that I'm not going to pay tax because my roads are not worked on. It's a compulsory levy.
If it were like that.
But that notwithstanding, there's a link between taxation and governance.
Yeah.
When you look at the unfortunate Kenyan situation, Kenya is paying 70% of their tax collections towards debt service. Uganda, we are still lucky. We are paying 30%, but it's still taking a strain on our resources, and that actually forces government to introduce new tax measures. So in terms of governance, our leaders and the politicians out there, you also have, as the president normally says, Olubimbi, you also have a role to play in this. A responsibility.
Oh, yeah, sure.
An undertaking to play in this. The majority of Ugandans do not participate in the decisions around debt acquisition. So if debt is acquired, let that debt be acquired prudently, let it be spent well, so that if it is spent well on infrastructure or other projects, we are going to have dividends. If those projects are yielding dividends, you do not have to increase taxes, because you would be paying for that. So there's an aspect to do with governance. And then also to the population, we have to remember that government cannot give us the services required unless if we pay taxes, because that is the only surest way of government raising finances.
Okay, quickly. I'm sorry, but you have 60 broadcasting seconds. Wrap up.
To supplement what you just said, so when government taxes citizens, there's an obligation on the government to at least return a bit of that tax through social services.
Yeah.
When I pay tax and then I see it being misused and misappropriated and spent on, you know, things like buying Land Cruisers, these expensive vehicles, and then
there's a disillusion that comes
so
from
there's a discomfort amongst the taxpayers that there is no zeal to pay tax when you see it being put to waste like that.
All right.
And
I'm afraid, my apologies, but time is not our very best ally. What I pick from that is that there should be value for money, and
exactly,
that if taxes are collected, there must be some bit of action on the part of the government that ensures that Ugandans can actually benefit in terms of infrastructure as well as services. Dennis Kakembo, many thanks for the perspectives and helping us understand what is no doubt a very complex subject, taxation, and of course many thanks to you to Mark Ruhimbi.
Thank
Both
you, Chris.
Tax lawyers, we have been emboldened by their understanding of the system. That will do it for the Kickstarter discussion. You're watching Morning at NTV. We'll be right back.